Hey friends, the Exiles in Babylon conference is right around the corner, April 18th through the 20th in Boise, Idaho. All the information is at theologyintherod.com. If you do want to attend live, and I would highly recommend if you can afford it, if you have the time to come out to Boise, Idaho, attend the conference live. Space is filling up, so you want to register ASAP. We are tackling loads of really important and very controversial topics. We're talking about deconstruction and the gospel. We're going to hear from people who have had a journey of deconstruction, tell us why they did so. We're going to hear about from women, talking about women power and abuse in the church. We're going to talk about LGBTQ people and the church. We're talking about different Christian views of politics. That should be loads of fun, if not really intense. And we just added a very important pre-conference symposium on the theology and politics of Israel-Palestine. And we're going to have different viewpoints represented, and various discussions are going to be engaged in with that really important conversation. So come to Boise. You can ask questions. You can engage the speakers, engage other people who are at the conference. It is loads of fun. It really is, I would say, the highlight of my year. So again, April 18th to the 20th, Boise, Idaho. Check out all the information at theologyintherod.com. Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. My guest today is Dr. J.R. Woodward, who received his PhD from University of Manchester. He is the co-founder of Missio Alliance and the national director for V3 Church Planting Movement. Okay, this episode is all about church planting and church leadership. J.R. is the author of several books, including Creating a Missional Culture, The Church as Movement, and his recent book, The Scandal of Leadership, which is a really fascinating book that wrestles with a lot of academic themes surrounding what church leadership should look like. So please welcome to the show for the first time, the one and only J.R. Woodward. All right. Hey, JR, thanks for coming on Theology in the Raw, man. I'm excited to meet you in person. We have a mutual friend in Dan White Jr. Tell him I said hi if you talk to him before I do.
I will.
He's still out in the Caribbean, right? Hanging out.
He's in Puerto Rico. Yeah. Doing the Caneo Center.
Yeah. I've had people. He was on last time. Been on a couple times. I want to say a couple years ago, and I've actually had listeners that have gone out there and done is it like a spiritual retreat or I'm not sure the language he uses.
I mean, I think of like healing and restoration especially for people working in ministry in different areas. And it's really kind of a healing, holistic time,
I've
had people, individual group retreats. Yeah.
I think I had some pastors that went out there after hearing him on the podcast. And so, so sounds like an awesome setup. I think we need a lot more of that. I want to get to, that kind of is related to what we're going to talk about, ecclesiology and leadership. Both are areas of your academic expertise, but also your passion, I know. Let's go back and let's just talk about the V3 movement. What is it? And what was the motivation in your heart in particular, and why you wanted to start this thing?
Yeah. So, I've been a church planter for like 25 years. So my first church was at Virginia Tech on the East Coast. And then my next few plants were in the Los Angeles area. I lived kind of in East Hollywood. And so I became a Christian in a church plant. And I think church planting is always something that I just thought was a natural thing to do to see the kingdom continue to grow and expand. And so I was looking to potentially go up to San Francisco and plant, but then but I had some hesitation. And so kind of to discern that, I went up there for a couple of weeks and I met with like 10 different planters, from people who've been there 3 months to 10 years, from the smallest to one of the largest in the city. And the last guy I talked to, I don't even remember his name, to be honest, but he was a guy who connected with Dallas Willard pretty early, after Willard wrote like The Spirit of the Disciplines or something. And Willard said to him, like, I know like this spiritual formation thing works for me individually, but maybe you can see how it works for your whole congregation. So this guy was kind of early on in that spiritual formation thing. And so when I met with him, like he just kind of asked me questions the whole time instead of me asking him. And And by the end, he goes, when you talked about this, your face really lit up, or he kind of just gave that type of feedback. And then he shared this story about St. Francis, which I've tried to find if it's valid or not, but I'm not quite sure if it is. Could be true, could not be. But apparently St. Francis was trying to discern his future, whether he should be an itinerant preacher or go and or just kind of stay in one place. And so he went to his trusted friends and asked them to discern on his behalf. And so they prayed, came back and said, "We think you should be an itinerant preacher." He says, "Thanks be to God." And that's what he did. And so that story kind of was one of the ways that God was speaking to me. Is like, I don't really want you to make this next decision. Like, I want you to go and find trusted friends and let them decide what your next thing is to be. So I kind of wrestled through that for a while. I wasn't that comfortable with it. But then I thought, okay, like, who would I have it? And I thought of about 7 people with at least one contrarian thinker by the name of David Fitch. I figured if they all agreed, I could take it as from God. If they didn't, I would go back and, take all that counsel into consideration. But, so I said I can stay in LA and continue to plant, go to San Francisco and plant, give myself over to helping church planters, or maybe there's another option. And through a long process, they all kind of discern, we think you should help, train church planters. Long story short, it was probably within a couple of weeks, I get a call from the Virginia Baptists who were looking for someone to head up their church planting. So it's like a 200-year organization, but they were really just starting like a little bit of a new thing, wanting somebody to do it, give their full-time attention to it. And so they really just gave me a whiteboard, do what you need to do. Here's some resources, and build a team. And that was kind of the beginning of V3. And every kind of movement, there's kind of this acronym that called CARTS, does things like coaching, assessment, recruiting, training, and supporting. And so I had to really decide which of these do I start with. And I felt like coaching and training were the 2 things that you could really build a sense of maybe a community and dynamic there. And I was, this was back in about 11 years ago. And at that time, I would say church planting boot camps was the most popular way that church planters got trained. 5 days, 7 days, we'll just give it all to you as if you're going to know how to plant a church after that amount of time. And so I just felt like, man, I feel like we need a couple of years. So we did these 9-year training, week to week, coach with planters in a group setting. And, and it was like, 6 months later, I brought Dan on, started to build a team. We developed it together and started it off. And so that's how a little bit of the origins of V3.
What is, it's about 10 years old. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. What are some of the, I guess, the main kind of ecclesiological values that go into V3? Like, what would a V3 church look like that would look different than another church next door?
That's great. Yeah. Good question. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of ways to explain that. I feel like, but one of the ways I like to, maybe the more holistic way, is like a grounded spirituality, a missional theology, and a movement ecclesiology. And I think each of these 3 have like some different dynamics to them. So when I think about a grounded spirituality, I'm really talking about the leader themselves. I kind of take the Lord's Prayer as a way to kind of look at what a grounded spirituality looks like. That first part of the prayer, a rooted identity, the vocational faithfulness that deals with thy kingdom come, this kind of contrast community that I think when he's talking about our daily bread and debts and forgiveness, I think we're dealing with relationships and economics and all of that. Spiritual formation, in particular, as it relates to how the powers try to subvert our leadership, deliver us from the evil one. And then what I would say is the kenotic leadership. And so in the very Lord's Prayer, I see the potential problem of leadership. It's interesting that, at least tradition as on, to thine be the kingdom, the power. What is it? For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Yeah, sorry. So, but the point is, like, this comes right after lead us not into temptation or deliver us from the evil one. And so
Mm.
I think the greatest temptation is to build our own kingdoms by our own power for our own glory,
Mm.
and so and it's a very big temptation for church planters. Church
So
planters tend to be go-getters,
yeah, okay. So this opens up a whole other. I mean, we can't talk about ecclesiology without talking about leadership, and leadership without ecclesiology. So let's just kind of tackle
Yep.
both of these, I guess, because I know you wrote a pretty large academic book on church leadership, which as a fellow academic, I so appreciated, because I think some church leaders, this is gonna make sure it sounds not negative, like a lot of church leadership books, let me just say, maybe aren't as academic as yours. Yours is a thick book, and you're wrestling with you integrate Walter Wink, his work, Rene Girard, William Stringfellow. We talked offline about how, dude, this guy's a hidden gem, Stringfellow.
Yeah.
And who was Oscar?
Oscar Romero.
Oscar Romero. So, I mean, is this part of your dissertation? Because you did a PhD
Yeah.
at Manchester, right? So is this? Yeah.
Yeah. I did my PhD at the University of Manchester, and this book is based on that. It's a bit more than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But the research from that is a core element of this book, and I'm really kind of seeking to give a deeper diagnosis to the problem of domineering leadership in the church.
Yeah.
And I realized, in order to kind of give a more meaningful remedy, we have to go beyond just a psychological and sociological analysis of the problem, but maybe look at it from a theology of the powers, because they shape the social and the personal, in my opinion. But given like the current plausibility structure that most of us live, developing a theology of the powers becomes a very huge task to undertake. So that's where Wink, Girard, and Stringfellow become some important dialogue partners.
Can you sum up? I mean, this is probably impossible to do, but can you sum up as briefly as you can, kind of the gist of what you're getting at in that book? Because I haven't read the whole thing, but as I was reading this is fascinating. I've never seen a church leadership book integrating these thinkers in particular, but these kinds of thinkers, and also addressing the issue of, well, like what you said, that there's a spiritual warfare going on, spiritual warfare going on, specifically targeting leaders and encouraging them to build their own kingdoms. And I've as obvious as that should be, I've never thought about it from that angle. So how would you summarize your passion for this idea of a more upside down view of leadership?
Yeah. Well, I think maybe some ways is kind of defining leadership to begin with. I kind of look at leader as identity, like our being. How do we develop a sense of self? Our praxis or our doing, and in particular, how do we use power? Mm-hmm. And then our telos, kind of what we're ultimate aim, what we're becoming, and where we're leading people to, which ideally is life in God and the kingdom of God, or new creation. And so if that's kind of what leadership is all about, I would also say, kind of based on, maybe you're familiar with James K. Smith, kind of desiring the kingdom and so forth. But, here he talks about he articulates a philosophical anthropology that understands humans, not just people as thinkers shaped by ideas, people as believers shaped by faith, but also, and most importantly, people as lovers shaped by desires. And so I do think what's most important about us as people is our desires. And so Girard is really the doctor of desire. And what Girard would say is that we don't self-generate our desire, but we mimic the desire of our models. So whoever we look up to, that's where we gain our desires. Now, and he kind of discovers this through some of the great novelists, but then he looks through anthropology, mythology, and other. He was a historian with his kind of earned PhDs. He got 6 conferred PhDs as well. But
6? Wow.
Yeah. But Girard, what I'm kind of doing is kind of trying to, in the words of kind of Wink, to name, unmask, and so that we can engage the powers, and even kind of understanding how do we understand the powers. And when I say powers, I'm kind of talking about Satan, the demonic, and the principalities and powers. And I like to distinguish those. I think that the principalities and powers were created good, are fallen, and can be redeemed. I think that Satan and the demonic are more emergent realities that have no path to redemption. And so, and again, like through a pretty detailed look at Wink and Girard, and I use like Matthew Krausman, like really you could say Girard kind of deconstructs Satan into this mimetic cycle, which we can talk about, whereas Krausman reconstructs Satan through his study of the body of sin and the emergence of that in Romans 5-8. Krausman's over at Yale, the faith, a professor over there. And so, yeah, I'm kind of doing a lot with these concepts, but ultimately maybe Stringfellow kind of puts a very practical bent on this, and he would talk about the principalities. So I'm talking about here the principalities and powers in particular as image, institution, and ideology. And so when you think about image, he talks about this is probably the most common principality. He talks about like Marilyn Monroe. There's Marilyn Monroe the person, and Marilyn Monroe the image. And so the public image is a principality. And so as with any idol, image seeks full devotion, and it's in conflict with us until we fully give ourselves over to it. So the principality demands that the person of the same name give up his life as a person to the service and homage of that particular image. And so when that surrender is made, the person in fact dies, but not physically. For that point, they're literally possessed by their own image. So in my sense, we either possess our image in God or we'll be possessed by our image. And I think even with all of the, being Twitter and all the different things, that makes image even more of a powerful thing in our life. And then institutions is another thing that kind of, again, they seek ultimate allegiance. And so most of us look for meaning in our life through our work, which typically takes place in some kind of institution. And according to Stringfellow, the guiding moral principle of an institution, be it a university, a corporation, or a church, is really the persevering of the institution. And then it's demanded by everyone who lives within its sphere of influence that they commit themselves to the service of that end, the survival of the institution. But when the institution exists, not for something greater than itself, but for its own survival, then he would say it becomes demonic. And all of those that live under its domain kind of is an invitation to bondage instead of freedom. And the church is an institution in that way as well. And then, but go ahead.
Well, sorry, you give it.
Stop me anytime.
Yeah. So, we might have to go back and unpack principalities and powers for somebody who maybe isn't familiar. They've read the phrase in Ephesians and like, wait, what? Like, what are we talking about? But institution, this is fascinating. Are you saying, or are they saying, and I guess you summarizing or agreeing with that, the very concept of an institution, is it it's not neutral? Like, is there some kind of intrinsic negativity, or I don't want to say evil might be too strong, but it's not just an institution, including the church, in as much as it reflects institutional qualities, can have a intrinsically negative quality to it, or
okay, so great, thank you for that super good quality. And probably the best place to look here is like Colossians 1:15-20 and some of the details there. But I would say that institutions were created by God, like whether like it's legal institutions, government, all of these things are to kind of bring a sense of order and out of chaos, right? Okay. And so they were created good. In our current state, they are fallen. Okay. And when they're fallen, they're open to the demonic. And there is a visible and invisible reality to institutions, to all institutions.
And real quick, open to the demonic in a unique way. I mean, in a sense, everything's open. Pigs are open to the demonic, according to Mark, right? So, but is there something? Is there something kind of particularly attractive to the demonic realm about institutions, and if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I don't. It's a little bit more powerful in an institution than an individual. So individuals are open, but also institutions. But when it happens in an institution, there's that collective nature that seems to have a greater impact. It's a stronger force, if you will. Okay. I would say, because, let's just kind of take you know, when I think we can see some evidences of how racism has affected different institutions, and how it, the evil is even more hideous and overwhelming when it's kind of embedded in an institution.
Can you define institution just briefly? Like, I think I know. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so
when does something
in some ways,
when does something
that
cross over from not being an institution to being an institution, or is it a fuzzy line?
I think it's a very interesting question. I think it's one because a lot of people. Number one, like I'm not one who thinks that institution in itself isn't, again, like the principalities and powers are created good, fallen, and can be redeemed. So for me, institution isn't the problem. Probably institutionalism is the problem.
Okay.
Sometimes people make institution negative. I don't hold that perspective. I think you could say that there's a weak sense of institution and a strong sense of institution. And I'll give you a couple examples. A weak sense of institution, and I think this would be, by theorists would say, I kind of mentioned this in my first book, Creating a Missional Culture. But when you have 2 or 3 people doing something regularly over a period of time, you have a weak sense of institution. That would be an institution. But then you also have something like Harvard, which is a college and university that's been around for a couple hundred years or whatever. And it's much more of an established and formal institution, right? So that would be kind of a strong institution. This kind of 3 or 4 people meeting over a regular period of time would be a weak sense of institution. And there'd be things in between that, obviously our government's been around for a while, so it's just kind of a strong institution. Some churches are just starting, so they're an institution, but weak. But then there's others that have been around for a couple hundred years or more. And so the nature of institution maybe is its longevity and maybe its size and influence, maybe speak to the weakness and strength of an institution. But yeah,
so churches can be a weak institution or a strong institution. Would you say if it's falling into a strong institution, are you seeing red flags or strong?
No. Like, so, and maybe the best way is when I say institution and principality, again, keep in mind, I'm saying these are created good, but they're fallen and they can be redeemed. So institution of any type can be redeemed. And what I would say is it becomes demonic when it seeks its own survival, instead of existing for something beyond itself. So even the church is to seek the kingdom first. If the church seeks its own self first, it becomes more demonic, in my opinion. Just like we ourselves are seek the kingdom first, the church is to be about the kingdom of God in whatever place it is. The moment it becomes about itself, it opens itself up to the demonic. In my opinion.
Every church is going to say it's about the kingdom of God.
I know, and this is this is the slyness of how the powers work, right? So we have to just be brutally honest with that, and as much as our conscious, and much as we can be aware of why we exist.
So you come into a church, they say, "All right, JR, we want you to come in and evaluate our institution and make sure we're not falling prey to demonic powers. You got a key to every door, to every office. You can talk to anybody you want. You can, just let us know, evaluate us, and tell us whether we are falling prey to the powers in our institution." What you're lighting up. You're like, "Oh, I would love to do that."
No.
What are some things? Okay, so again, every church is going to say, well, of course we're for the kingdom of God. Everything we do is for the kingdom of God. What are some things you would identify that would tangibly show that maybe there are some areas that are betraying maybe that mission?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I haven't been asked to do that, but I have done kind of just health assessments of churches. And I probably look at leadership. I look at how they approach mission. I look at the culture of the congregation. And when I look at the culture, you're kind of looking at also the underlying assumptions that the congregation has. I think you could look at the artifacts that whether it's the building, the place, the websites, whatever type of artifacts are there, I would interview people. And I think through learning, you kind of learn what people are trusting and again, what their underlying assumptions are, how they're living those out. And again, all of us, individually and collectively, we face the spiritual warfare, for the desires of our heart, right? Where is our ultimate desire? Is it for God and His kingdom, or is it for ourselves? Is it for something else? These are not easy things to discern, but it would have to take a pretty broad analysis, and then I would probably just make suggestions based on what I discovered through that analysis. I don't think I go in kind of looking for a particular thing. I think it becomes evident through the assessment.
Let me ask it a different way. What are some common characteristics of a church that has fallen into really negative institutions?
Yeah, I think if they're like survival oriented, like, oh, we're just trying to survive, that can be a flag to be concerned about. If they're
like if they got into a building that's say they're, and this actually happens a lot, right? They're growing, and then they say we need a bigger building, so they invest, let's say $10 million into a building that's still bigger than what they need at the moment, but given the trajectory of growth, they're like, well, by the time we build this building, we're going to be able to fill it, whatever. And then I don't know, a pandemic hits, or the pastor preaches a sermon that people don't like, and or a new church shows up and people kind of drift over there, or there's economic downturn, something interrupts that pattern of growth. So now they're in this building where it's like, oh my gosh, we need 300 more people to come regularly. Hopefully at least 10% of them will be giving at least 5% of their income. We to big budget, we need to do that. Is that it?
Yeah.
And I'm sure this is not a fictitious scenario.
No,
Would that be an example of a church that has gotten into survival mode?
It's potential, right? Like, I think it depends at that point what they're trusting in, right? And so if they're starting to think competitively, say with the other churches, or if there's this kind of undue pressure, so those can be things that can push them toward that direction. But obviously we could face challenges and test and trust God with that and do it in a healthy way. But those would be things that could potentially push you to trust yourself instead of trusting God. I think there's always a choice involved there. I think when we're overly concerned for church growth, or survival, or it's always going to lead to the potential, the temptation to, in a sense, like to, what was I think the archetypical temptations of Jesus might speak to kind of the issue we're talking about here. The political temptation where Jesus, the devil goes like, hey, I'll give you all these kingdoms. Just bow down to me. Like this is kind of the temptation. What we're talking about is building our kingdom, but in the way, not in the way of God, in the way of the devil. There's either it's the way of God or it's the way of the devil. There is no middle course, in my opinion. The devil and the ways of the world are sometimes what we're taught as Christians to do. So we sometimes mimic the business world and we uncritically bring it into the church world and think that somehow we're going to be immune to the problems that come along with that. I think this is one of the issues I have with a lot of current leadership books, is that there is no kind of trying to discern what is good and what is bad. Like we can learn from everywhere. All truth is God's truth. But we must kind of critically engage everything, and we need to look at the underlying assumptions that different ways of the world kind of bring to us, because there is a way of the world and there's the way of Christ. Yeah. And the temptation for Christ was just to bring the kingdom, not in the way that the Father was wanting him to, but in the way the devil was inviting him to. And so we will always have that invitation. And it will not just come knocking at our door once, it will come multiple times. And the situation that you presented is a very keen time for that temptation to come. That doesn't mean that church would necessarily fall to it at that time. but it's much more of a temptation, I would say.
You mentioned something in passing that I just want to kind of follow up on that, and I want to make sure I understand you correctly because it made sense that, and I'm trying to be really careful with my wording here, that the same kind of personality that might attract somebody to church planning. I mean, you can't be a passive, non-ambitious, introverted, well, maybe you can be person, like church planners attract go-getters. They're entrepreneurial. They want to build something, right? They're rolling the dice. They're taking risks. They want to, in a sense, and I don't say this negative, this is my personality. Like they want to be the boss, not answer to a boss. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I've been an independent person now for over 10 years, and I can't imagine, like, I love it. I love waking up and doing what I want to do and not going to do what somebody else is telling me they want me to do,
Sure.
And it could be bad. It could be terrible, but I don't think it's intrinsically bad. So, but have you found that the same kind of personality that attracts somebody to want a church plant also opens up maybe some unique temptations to want to build their own kingdom, because they do have this kind of drive, this entrepreneurial spirit, this, like, is that a correlation there? And I don't want to.
No, I think it's a great question, and I maybe even seen studies where they talk about narcissism in the church and how many pastors are narcissists.
It's a breeding ground for narcissists. I feel like, but think about like what's a successful pastor? Somebody who grows a church and preaches great sermons and can make people feel good and is not passive and shy and meek. Like, he's on stage. Like, it takes a lot to get on stage. Narcissists love to be on
kind
stage.
of this, and I think
not everybody who likes to be on stage is a narcissist. I'm not saying that, but yeah.
No. Yeah, and so at V3, I'll kind of wrap in our V3 element too, but one of the things that we look at is the fivefold: the apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, teacher. And I think the apostolic gifted person is kind of likely to be a good church planter. I think any of the fivefold can plant. They'll just plant differently at different paces in different ways. But your typical planter today would probably be apostolic or evangelist. These are very outward oriented gifts that they tend to have a level of, confidence and so forth, faith, looking forward. There's a little bit of outward orientation, which is needed. But, and I think the downside, is, I think, apostolic evangelists tend to be fairly confident type people. And so the difference between having confidence in God and confidence in self, Paul was an intelligent man. He was a super capable builder of the church. He was an expert builder, we're told in Corinthians, but he didn't trust in himself. He learned to trust in God. My sufficiency doesn't come in myself, but it comes from God. And I think that becomes an important element for if you want to say like natural leader, the temptation of the natural leader is to live in the natural and not to trust and abide in the Spirit as we should do. And without the dependence on the Spirit, we're going to, be prone to a lot of problems.
Yeah. Again, that's something that's easy to say, but it's like, tangibly, are we doing that? It's hard to identify sometimes. Are we operating in our flesh to build our own kingdom, or operating in the Spirit to build God's kingdom? That can tangibly look exactly the same on paper, right? I mean,
that's right. Like the fruit could look very similar. It can be super hard to discern. I do think that that there are some signs that can kind of help us. Like again, when I kind of get to the remedy, I kind of look at like Philippians through a Girardian lens. And in particular, I'm kind of trying to understand Philippians 2, this kind of whole kenotic journey that Jesus takes. What does that mean? But, at the very beginning, it says, consider others more important than yourself. Like that's a pretty simple thing to consider. Now, that does have complications when we're kind of in the flow of life and we're thinking through our relational connections and like, how am I, how am I kind of like, am I considering this person first? And the complication comes too, because like, what if there's needed correction here? And how does that put that person first and so forth? So it's not, there's always a need for discernment. And I think this is why we need other people in our lives. One of the things that we really encourage at V3 is polycentric leadership as opposed to just hierarchical. So shared leadership.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. That, polycentric just means poly, many centers. And so even V3, like I didn't want to do this by myself. So I invited Dan, and now we have Jesse, and the three of us kind of lead this together. And so sometimes I'm leading and sometimes I'm following. I think that's important. One of the problems has when you're a solo leader, and my first book kind of addresses, hierarchy, flat versus polycentric. And I would say when you think about hierarchical, it leads to a controlling leader. Spiritual formation tends to be more pragmatic and individualistic because you just have one leader who's kind of an example. And mission tends to be extractional, meaning oftentimes we're extracting people from their place of mission to come to our gathering because it tends to be a Sunday-centric oriented place. And how many people come to our gathering tends to be the measure of success. Yeah. And so we're actually sometimes extracting them from their place of mission as opposed to blessing them in their space. On the other hand, you have flat, which is a reaction, which sometimes is absent of leadership. It tends to lends itself to more of a fuzzy, unfocused sense of spiritual formation. And I find oftentimes stagnant when it comes to mission. Polycentric is really just shared leadership. It models communal formation. Like we don't form just by our individual selves. We're always kind of formed by other people. What do we usually say when someone needs healing and wholeness? It happens in community. Join some type of community group. And yet oftentimes leaders have no community. If you look at all of the fallen leaders that we've seen, they're very much isolated selves that no longer can live under the rules that they're asking everybody else to live under. And so shared leadership by nature demonstrates and models a type of community under Christ that can be mimicked by those around. And I think that leads to multiplication of mission because, in some ways, every leader has a chance to actually live on mission as well. Because if you're just a sole leader, you have to take care of so many different things within the church. You probably have a hard time being outside of the church, connecting with everyday people who don't know Christ. But if you have multiple leaders sharing the responsibilities, we each have opportunity to be living a mission in our neighborhood, in our networks, and making a difference and being an example. And there's nothing more important than being an example when it comes to what leadership is. That's kind of what Peter tells us in 1 Peter 5.
Hey friends, Preston here. I just received the coolest message from a Theology in the Raw listener, and I wanted to share it with you. Take a listen to this.
I'm Ashlyn, and I'm a Theology in the Raw listener. I was listening to a podcast and heard Preston talk a little bit about when you're in ministry and you're teaching scripture, the importance of biblical languages. And I felt really compelled by that. I've always been interested in biblical languages, and I tell my students all the time, like, context is key. And so much of that lies within the biblical languages. And I was praying, I was like, okay, Lord, I want to learn biblical languages for an affordable price in an environment that's conducive to my stage of life, where I'm at and what I need. And I kid you not, the next podcast I clicked on was advertising Kairos. And it was just a perfect opportunity, checked all of my boxes of not homework heavy, very practical, based on learning, not on passing tests, very much the way that I learn. And there was an opportunity to take a class on a Friday morning in my own home online. And it's just been so practical and so effective and so helpful. And it's been really cool just how fast you begin to pick up on it because it is so practical. So if you have been wondering if you should learn the biblical languages, if that's something that you would benefit from, the answer is yes. You will always benefit from gathering more context into the scriptures that shape the entirety of our life and our belief system. And it's not as complicated as I think we can make it out to be, or as daunting as we make it out to be. The way that the teachers teach and the way that the class is oriented, the way that the homework is it's very practical, it's very digestible, and it's little by little. It's fun, whenever you actually get to see progress so soon. The way that it's wired is you're not waiting months upon months upon months to grasp a language, because this isn't something that you're learning to speak or write necessarily. You're reading and understanding and recognizing. It's a lot more practical than it may come across, and it's definitely worth it. You should definitely check it out. It's been a really great decision.
It's so awesome when we get to bring to you the Theology in the Raw family resources that actually make a big impact in your life. And Kairos Classroom has quickly become one of those resources that I hope you'll check out by visiting www.kairosclassroom.com. And don't forget to use our special code TITR. That's kairosclassroom.com with the code TITR. With your model of shared leadership, communal leadership, polycentric, do you believe in like a first among equals? I've heard people use that phrase that we are all equal, and yet there still might be one particular leader who's still at the end of the day, not in a hierarchical way, but maybe more of an what would be the opposite if he's first among?
Yeah.
I don't know.
No.
Like,
so you bring a good question. So I'll kind of give you some example. Like I'm gonna give you a non-church example first. Switzerland has 7 presidents.
Seriously?
Yeah, and they've had it for like 150 years.
How did I not know that? Okay, yeah.
They, I'm pretty sure it's Sweden or Switzerland, but I'm pretty sure it's Switzerland. We can double check on that. But yeah, 7 presidents. They have equal authority, but they have 1 point president. Okay. They don't get more votes or more say, but they do kind of are the kind of point person for that year, and that rotates around. And so if you kind of think of like a polycentric leadership, if you think of the geese who fly in a V, there's the point geese, but the point geese doesn't stay there. They rotate around. So they kind of take that wind for a little while, but then they can't endure that for so long, so somebody else rotates in. That's, or think about a jazz band, like a jazz band where you have people that play these different instruments. They're all super great musicians. If they get in the groove, a good jazz band will just start kind of different instruments will lead out at different times just intuitively because they know each other. I think that's kind of like ideal picture of how polycentric leadership works. So yeah, I would say at points you always have somebody leading and somebody following, but there's a collectiveness in not every decision has to be done by everybody. You kind of decentralize as much as you can anyway. But when you're kind of building, dealing with important issues and so forth, you probably want to have somewhat of a sense of what the Spirit is for everybody.
Now, again, this is one of those things that makes total sense when you explain it. It looks good on paper, and I think a lot of people strive for it. Have you seen this work out in practice well? Where the way you're describing?
Yeah. So, yes and no. Like I would say every form of leadership has its challenges. And I think that shared leadership, if leaders are not healthy, like, it will create more rivalry when you have shared leadership. It just kind of does that. But, at the same time, like, rivalry will happen in a hierarchical leadership as well. So, I think the danger of solo leadership is kind of what we see happen in the church all over the place today, right? We know that hasn't been working well. I think again, my book, Creating Mission Culture, really takes the most time in that. making a case for polycentric leadership. But I look at it theologically, I look at it
Mhm.
scripturally, I look at it like emotionally, spirit, like just through 5 different angles. And then I
Mhm.
look at the fivefold as a way to kind of these 5 types of leaders working together being
Mhm.
important. But yeah, it has its challenges, no doubt. Can it work? Yes. V3, Dan and I've been leading it for a while. Jesse now is a part of it. Sometimes we have people come in and out, but those who practice and have a mutual humility, that's what's needed. You kind of constantly need the humility, but
Mhm.
you're constantly in community as leaders.
Mhm.
I think it's ideal.
Mhm.
It's not always easy, but it's a great check and balance for leaders' lives, and I think it's sorely needed today. Like we definitely need something other than what we have right now.
Do you, in my world at least, and I live in a weird,
Yeah,
I don't know, subset of evangelicalism. When people talk about, yeah, their evangelical experience, I'm like, that's just not the world I live in.
yeah,
I don't know. So
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I feel like everybody, pretty much everybody I know in the church leadership world would all be for. To me, it's just a done deal. It's like 2 + 2 = 4, and you shouldn't have a top-down CEO model. Like CEO leadership is like just a negative phrase, you know. Like so
Right,
again,
right.
and again, I mean, people can say that and fall into something that they say they're not doing. So I don't want to say in practice it's all perfect, but
Yeah, yeah.
the idea of kind of communal, humble leaders that are leaning on each other and not being isolated, to me, that's just a given. It's almost like, wait, that's not the norm out there. So I guess my question is, that's not the norm out there. Like, like
Well,
is the top down CEO model still a thing out there? I know it
oh
is,
yeah,
but
yeah. I think it's pretty common. I would say, senior pastor or lead pastor is maybe the more common thing now.
I mean,
You
that's, yeah,
know,
I gotta see that a lot. Yeah.
and but like, yeah, not when I say a genuinely Palestinian, I think a lot of our planters are living, seeking to live into that. Maybe 60%
Okay.
do that, but and that's with us purposefully
Mm,
helping them, because it is not what people have been exposed to. Um,
mm,
kind of what I'm talking about, like in a genuine shared way.
yeah.
That's not. It's just hasn't been modeled for us as a
Hmm.
whole.
Joe Hellerman, I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
embracing shared ministry. He's got a great book on that.
I love him.
Uh,
Yeah, he's great. I mentioned him a number of times in my last couple of chapters.
oh, cool. Yeah, yeah. So what's going on in do we have a crisis of failing leaders in the church today? Here's my, it seems like every time you turn around, you have some scandal, something happened, or at the very least, a burnout. I think there was a survey, oh gosh, was it burn? I don't know, like where, if it asked pastors, if you could do something else, would you? And like it was a crazy high percentage that said, well, yeah, of course I would I just thought, what am I going to do? This is how I earn a paycheck, and then all the scandals and adulteries and affairs and what, or narcissism and blowing up. Is it a crisis unique to our cultural moment, or is it simply being exposed much more than we're used to through social media and anybody with a social media account can kind of blow the whistle or whatever. So
Mm,
have we always been living in this kind of crisis, or is it we only hear the negative reports? This
mm,
is something I've thought about. Like I know loads of humble, godly pastors who don't need to be on stage. They truly want to serve people. In my own church, it's a decent sized church, 2,000-3,000, and
yeah,
it's funny, on paper it has a CEO model. The pastor, it's a Calvary Chapel, and from
yeah,
what I hear, their model is the senior pastor has all unilateral authority, and like like so my senior pastor could do whatever he wants without, and he is the opposite.
yeah,
Like he does not, he would give up the pulpit any day that he doesn't make, he's like delegates everything like other people. Like he's the most communal almost to a fault. Like he just like lets other,
Yeah.
even on paper, he has all this power, and he just says, I don't want that power. That's sickening, like
Yeah.
Where am I going with this? Oh, but he'll never make the news unless he has an affair, right?
Right. Yeah, right.
And I know loads of people that like the loads of just humble, godly pastors that are pastoring a church in middle of Iowa, 200-person church, whatever. I'm sure.
Yeah.
Bigger
No,
cities, you know what I'm getting at. So question: do you find that we are in a unique crisis of leadership, or are we just exposed to the small percentage of bad leaders that are out there?
I think maybe what I'm kind of trying to say, it's more than just about individual people, that we have to kind of consider and analyze the problem that has been, I don't know if I would be, I couldn't give you an expert opinion on the question that you asked, like, are we experiencing more of it or not? Because all the nuances that you mentioned are there, right?
It's hard to quantify.
Yeah, it's not a new problem. It's an old problem. Peter was addressing it in his book, 1 Peter 5, right? So it's been, people have been lording it over since the first century. I think it's always been a perpetual problem. And I think it's potentially has the systemic elements to it, and spiritual elements to it. And so I'm trying to say that all of us kind of should be more mindful of what is at work and what is seeking to subvert our leadership, because it can happen to any of us. None of us are immune to the temptations of the powers. That's really what I'm saying.
Okay.
And I do think that there may be some spaces today. We talked about image, institution. We didn't talk about ideology, which is another principality. But I would say image seems to be more powerful today because social media, right? We can project and our own image, for us to live to our image and versus living in our image of God, is much more of a temptation today than before because of our social media presence, right? We can be inauthentic selves in this case, in a podcast, in a tweet, in whatever. It's easier because we're not kind of day to day with the same people, where it's much easier for people to discern what is real and what is not, right? So I think we are in a time and a space where the potential for some of these things may be greater than they have been in the past, and also the awareness greater of the problem. But it's not just a church problem; it's a societal problem, and it's large. And I do think that with some of the problem comes with technology, and the technology itself, is kind of works with the principalities and powers and strengthens them. Jacques Ellul, who I studied, was huge on technology and very weary of it. McLuhan, after studying him for a little while, I'm more aware of, both the positive and negatives of technology and the power that is much more maybe invisible to our eye and our thinking, but very, very effective on us. It has a power over us that we often don't see, and that's what makes it even more powerful. And so in some ways, I'm trying to, in the book, The Scandal of Leadership, I'm trying to make visible what is often less visible to most people.
With the social, that's interesting, and I think, how can you disagree? Like that you do have this temptation. And okay, so it's not limited to church pastors and leaders, but since that's what we're talking about, you do have this temptation to build let me use a neutral phrase, or build a presence, or have an influence that goes outside your local church responsibilities. Do you think that is neutral, or do you think that should be warned against? I mean, you take someone like a Eugene Peterson, and I know he was really old when technology started really taking off and stuff. So you can blame it maybe on his age or whatever. But I think in principle, I think if he was alive today and in his prime, I don't think he would post his sermons like on a podcast.
Probably not.
And he, like when Bono reached out, he didn't even know who Bono was. It's the greatest thing ever. You know, he's like, who? Some Irish rock star? All right, yeah, sure. Let me pencil you into my calendar. You know, but he was so focused on even writing books. Like he did that primarily for his own church, or working on his own. Like you get the impression he never once tried to build some kind of platform that can be a negative term, like have some massive influence outside his church. I mean, his church walls. Now God gave him that, and he absolutely had he did have that.
Yeah.
You get the impression that he never really cared or pursued that. Like, would your advice for leaders to kind of be there, or would you say no? Like, if you have influence outside and use the gifts God's called you? Because
yeah. I think like Peterson. And what I really appreciate about his work is I think he understood how the powers work, and his awareness of that really shaped his practice and his heart and his desire. I think there's probably in us a natural and not necessarily negative desire to influence for the good. I think that would be in all of us, and for that to expand as far as possible. Like for us, you know, we're trying to have movemental churches. Now, what that means, that's different than egotism. You know, it requires like, you know, the opposite. So, I mean, in a sense, people like Eugene Peterson and Dallas Willard, they didn't seek glory for themselves. They humbled themselves, and God glorified them in the process and gave them influence. And so I think this is the challenge, is like we are made to be kind of co-heirs with Christ, and we're justified and we will be glorified. But what we don't realize is that glory comes through humility. It's the way of the cross that actually God lifts up. There is no other thing that he lifts up. We lift up everything else. It's either us trying to lift ourselves up, or God lifts up those who are humble. So when Jesus was on the cross, what we see is that humility was exalted. And I think that's what we see in the life of Eugene Peterson. That's what we see in the life of like a Dallas Willard. And we are called to, you know, that kenotic, humble, and obedient life, and that seeks God and his kingdom first. And I can say myself, like, I would love to be influential and help anybody and everybody come to know Christ, to have a life that's worth living and imitating, and however God would want to use that. But like how that comes about, and not seeking that for myself, but you know, that's the tension part. And I think that, you know, I think Dallas, for example, I mentioned him in my 10th chapter. We were hosting a conference, and we had Dallas speaking, and I was kind of the MC. And you know, Dallas, if you've kind of seen him speak or heard him speak, he's not like an impressive speaker. And so, meaning like, what I mean by that is like, it's not like his oratory is, you know, fascinating to listen to and so forth. So anyway, he was finished speaking. I was supposed to introduce the question and answer time. And while I'm sitting, I feel like the Spirit is saying me to say something that I didn't want to say, but the Spirit kind of continued to impress on me. So I get up and I kind of pat Dallas on the back and I say, Dallas, you know, you're not a great speaker. Like everybody's looking at me like I'm crazy. Like, JR, what are you saying? This is Dallas Willard. And like gasp, you know, in the group. And then, but I noticed that everybody was on the edge of their seat when they were listening, just like waiting for the next word to drop. And the whole time he's like patting me on the back as if to say, JR, I understand what you're saying. And he kind of told us, like, I purposefully he purposely kind of speaks in a more monotone voice and doesn't want to use kind of certain things to somehow pull people in, but really allow the power of the Spirit to move through him. Now, that's how he understood it. He never once did a book proposal. It was always people asking him. On the other hand, Eugene Peterson wrote book proposals, had them refused, and did them. I don't think there's like kind of one little message, but it's ultimately, are we are we kind of following this kinetic path and really looking at others more important and trying to not build our sense of identity in the way that the world kind of dictates to us? Because I think that's the temptation. When you think about how Paul understood the canonic journey, I think he explains, the whole book of Philippians, by the way, it seems like a book about good models and poor models. Jesus is the ultimate model, Philippians 2. Then you have Timothy lifted up as a model, Epaphroditus. You have some poor models who were enemies of the cross. And then Paul himself lifts up as the model. But when he's giving his autobiography there, it's in the same format as kind of what they found, like 7,000 inscriptions in Philippi, which by the way, in Philippi, the greatest commodity was honor. There was nothing more great than prestige and honor. Joseph Hellerman does a great job at pointing that out. And they had, the way they got their honors, there was ascribed honor and there was achieved honor, right? And the ascribed honor is what they were born with, achieved was what they achieved. And that was the order and even importance, like your ascribed honor was much more powerful because it was immovable. And so Paul, in addressing the Judaizers, he starts off like, hey, you talk about circumcision as somehow this makes you greater than everybody else. He goes, I was circumcised the 8th day. I was a tribe of Benjamin. He starts in with his ascribed honor, and then he goes into his achieved honor. Hey, I was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. It was with the law. I was faultless. It was with the church. I was, a persecutor. All of those gained him a great sense of honor within his Jewish community at the time. And what did he say? I consider all of that garbage compared to knowing Christ, the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his suffering. He moved from this kind of domain of death where his identity was formed in a particular way that the culture kind of created. And he went to a whole different way. It was all about Christ. And I think what we're talking about, Jesus, although he was God, did not consider that something to be grasped, did not try to hold on to that, did not use that to his own advantage is another way it talks about, but emptied himself. I think he was emptying himself he did not gain his sense of identity by the dictates of the world, or you could say Satan or the devil, right? The temptations. But before the temptations, what happened? This is my son in whom I'm well pleased. He was secure in his identity through the Father, and before he even started doing any ministry. And so I think maybe the most important thing about us as leaders is where we get our sense of identity and what our telos is, because that will dictate our practice or our use of power. If our identity in any way is kind of shaped, and I would say in general, Christian culture tries to misshape our identity, and we get it by different accolades and so forth and so on. Not by, you are the beloved son or daughter, of God as what is foundational and what ought to give us, the greatest sense of joy, in knowing God and knowing Christ but his power in the suffering. But it's usually other things that other accolades that we kind of rest our sense of identity on. I think that's what's dangerous. And I think that's what is perpetuated in the church oftentimes. It's something that Willard and Eugene were great examples at running away from.
Absolutely, man. Yeah. Yeah, that I didn't know that about. Actually, I've heard that about Willard, that he wasn't the most dynamic speaker, but I can only imagine being on the edge of your seat because of the character, really.
Right.
The character, the wisdom, a person who so clearly desired the presence of God more than most, and what that breeds in somebody to be in God's presence so vibrantly. And you want to hear from that kind of person, even if it is without all the rhetorical flourish. I mean, especially this day and age, I feel like the more rhetorically persuasive somebody is, it's almost like the more skeptical people are. Like, what are you hiding? You're too good, like.
Right.
Okay, we were short on time here, and I have two very different controversial questions for you. I will throw them out and let you pick maybe one to give your thoughts on if you want. First of all, we're talking about church leadership. We haven't even mentioned women. And I would love your thoughts on that. Not to give a theological defense. I don't even know what your views are on what women in church leadership. But would love, any thoughts you have on that. Or we are in an election year, and we are going into we've been living in political, or I should more specifically say partisan polarization that has wreaked havoc on the church. I mean, how many churches split, face all kinds of divisions and animosity during the last election season because you had people that had all these politicized views or whatever. We're going into another one that might be even more heated. And the last time this happened, and not just last time, it was since the Civil War, we've had political divisions in the church. But I mean, in my generation, it seems like from 2016 on, it's just been really, really intense, and I think social media plays a role there, and just so many things going on. But I look back and it's like, has this been a failure of leadership? Like, how have we not prepared our people to be disciples of the kingdom and not let something like a 3-inch mask divide the church? I write about this in my forthcoming book, and it's like, how are we going to take on the principalities of the kingdom of darkness if we can't if the blood of Christ isn't strong enough to unify us around a question about whether to wear a 3-inch mask on our face? And I'm not even picking a side here on them. I'm just saying, like, churches, literally blood-bought churches celebrating the risen Messiah who commands the universe and it stands at his attention. That blood-bought organization, spirit-filled, couldn't hold it together over a mask. That's insane. I mean, when you really think about it, Satan is doubled over. He's like, you can't make this stuff up. This is so easy. This is easy. Like, we're going into another season, and I do put responsibility on leaders to prepare our people to be disciples of the kingdom of God and not let the kingdom of Babylon and all their partisan. You could probably, maybe I'm showing my hand a little bit too much on what I want you to address. If you have thoughts on either one here, women.
Well, I would just say I affirm women in every role. I think we have women apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers in the scripture, and we should have them today. But to speak to the other one, like this divisiveness, I think is a super sad reality. I do think the powers are at work here, in particular through ideology. So I didn't get to talk about that, but that is probably the most recognizable principality. I don't think that we realize, though, how ideology enslaves us and divides us. And so ideologies are these isms that take people, especially leaders, but whole groups, captive. So there's communism, fascism, nationalism. These are maybe recognized principalities that dehumanize people. It's less likely for us to recognize humanism or capitalism or rationalism or democracy as potential fallen principalities. But all ideologies are principalities, and they have common characteristics in that they have absolutized themselves and they demand unconditional loyalty from the individual and society. They have their own account of sin and redemption. And so, like any fallen principality, they claim ultimate allegiance. And so every developed ideology has, a sense of like, creation, fall, and redemption. And this is kind of the problem is I think oftentimes that the third temptation that I talk about in the scale of leadership is what Jacques Ellul calls the ideological religious temptation. And he kind of calls it the religious temptation in ideology because, first of all, it's by Luke's kind of order. Jesus is on the temple. He's in Jerusalem. It's a spiritual place. It's the only time where the devil comes to Jesus with the word of God itself as a temptation. Doesn't the scriptures say you throw yourself from the temple and the angels will catch you, right? And so the scripture itself now is being used. So what is the temptation here? I think it's like when we are unknowingly shaped by an ideology it shapes our very reading of the text.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we're locked into captive to an ideology, whether it's a conservative or progressive,
Mm-hmm.
and you see it on both sides.
Yeah.
The other, we demonize the other, and Girard
Mm-hmm.
would say, we know that we have been captive to an ideology when we demonize the other. And when do we demonize the other? We can no longer talk to them. We can no longer converse. There is no rational discussion anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
Literally, we have kind of scapegoated the other. We've demonized them. I think that's when we know that we're captive to an ideology, not the kingdom of God, certainly not the kingdom of God. That's not what Jesus learned to love his enemy. If there's anything that we need to learn today is enemy love.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, and it's difficult because the issues on one side, it's this is kind of the most moral thing.
Mm-hmm.
On the other side, this might be the most just thing. And it's kind of that sense that overtakes us but again, I would say that I think it's ideologically driven when we can no longer converse. The moment we demonize others is probably we're under some shape of the powers at that point. It's a good way to discern if we're under the powers or not.
That makes that makes so much sense. Yeah. And that's leadership in the secular world. You demonize the other. You tear them down to build yourself up. And it really has all these very secular Roman, demonic, not Roman in the, as if I have something against the city of Rome, but like Roman in the first century, kind of this grasping for power and domineering the other,
or just wanting to be right. It's like this kind of desire to be right, not this humility, not this kind of holding things lightly. Like, hey, I have a pretty strong conviction about this, but I'm open. Why don't you come at me? Let me know what you think.
Yeah.
Where is that gone? I think it absolutely ruins any witness that we have hope to have, because what did Jesus say to us? Like, it will be by the love that we have for one another that they will know that you're my disciples, that they will know that I am the one the Father sent. Our unity and witness are wrapped up together. And so the devil will try to destroy that. And he's doing a great job and utilizing, I think some political ideologies to divide the church as much as at any time.
Yeah, absolutely. Man, we'd love to keep unpacking that, because it's I think it's going to be it is a huge already. It's been a huge issue in the church. I really want leaders to, rather than responding, putting out fires after they're already raging, but like do some preemptive discipleship work in their congregations, so that in a sense you're kind of protecting the flock against these ideologies that are screaming towards them, that are trying to captivate their hearts and minds to get their allegiance. These ideologies, I love the way you frame it, these ideologies that are demonically infused are actively trying to wrench your allegiance away from the risen Savior toward whatever alternative kingdom is out there, whether it's a Republican or Democrat or progressive, conservative, whatever. There's an aggression here, right? It's not just some neutral thing. Oh, avoid that. Like, people are there are there's an aggression here that I think people need to understand how vigilant we need to be to protect ourselves from it. But
because ideology is essentially idolatry, and idolatry again is the most formidable sin that we can commit, because it speaks to where our allegiance is. And in the moment, like, kingdom first isn't our allegiance. If it's country first, if it's party first, if it's whatever first, family first, like, all of those are false sense of kingdom first. Kingdom first is what it means to be a Christ follower. And I think we need to redisciple ourselves and others toward that end.
You've got a great tweet pinned on your profile. Yeah, all these different firsts. would you say family first is what nepotism, and people first is racism, like a people group. Yeah, people group, or in the country first is nationally. That's really good.
Yeah.
Hey, JR, I've taken enough of your time. Appreciate you, man. And your book, at least from what I've read and digested, Scandal Leadership is incredible. So encourage people to check that out.
Thanks,
Thank
man.
you so much for being on Theology in the Raw.
All right, man.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.